Have you ever had a moment you didn't expect, but it ended up changing your whole life? It was one of those evenings where the world feels wrapped in quiet, the kind of dusky hour when the sun has already slipped behind the rooftops and left the streets washed in soft gray shadows, when the air tastes faintly of rain, even if no drops have fallen, and when you walk home with your thoughts carrying more weight than the groceries in your bag, thinking about nothing and everything at once, until something interrupts the rhythm and makes you stop in your tracks. For Anna Carter, 25 and accustomed to solitude, that interruption came in the form of a pair of eyes she almost didn't notice at first, a pair of dark brown eyes that seemed too large for the thin, fragile face they belonged to, eyes that caught the dim light like small lanterns flickering with equal parts fear and hope. She had just turned onto her street, her tote bag slung against her side, the quiet sound of her sneakers brushing the pavement the only thing keeping her company, when she realized there was a shape following her. At first she dismissed it as a trick of the corner lamps, or maybe just another neighbor's cat darting by. But when she turned her head and her gaze landed on him, she froze because there, just a few steps behind her, stood a stray dog. He was not the kind of dog that made you exclaim in delight at first sight. Not the fluffy sort you'd see bounding across park grass in some perfect commercial, but something more haunting and raw. His fur, once white, was now dulled with dust and grime, with patches thin enough to reveal the outline of his ribs, and though his body seemed worn, his stance carried an odd dignity, like a traveler who had been walking for too long, but refused to give up. His ears told their own story, one floppy and bent forward, the other cocked sideways at a strange angle that gave him a lopsided, unforgettable look, a look that might have drawn a laugh if it weren't softened by the weight of his thin frame. And that tail, not bushy, not strong, just a narrow line of fur with missing patches, moved the tiniest bit as she looked at him, a hesitant wag that seemed to say, "I know I don't belong here, but please don't turn away." Anna's first thought was not heroic or extraordinary. It was simple, almost instinctive. Why me? Why tonight? She had walked this street 100 times before, carrying the same groceries, passing the same cracked pavement, with no companion but her own shadow, and yet here was this stray, choosing her footsteps to mirror, keeping his distance, but never letting the gap widen too far. She quickened her pace, curious if he would break away, but when she slowed again, he slowed too, and, in that rhythm, something stirred inside her chest, something she had not felt in a long while, the awareness of another being attuned to her, watching her, needing her in a way that was unspoken but undeniable. Have you ever felt that uncanny tug, when a creature that doesn't even share your language somehow seems to speak directly to your heart? That was what Anna felt, standing there on that dusky street, torn between brushing him off and letting him follow. She tried to rationalize it away. Maybe he was hungry, maybe he was just wandering, maybe he would move on if she ignored him. But when she shifted her tote bag higher on her shoulder and resumed her walk, he resumed his too, his thin paws padding softly, quietly just behind her. Every so often, she glanced back, and every time, he was there, his gaze steady, not pleading exactly, but waiting. By the time she reached the small iron gate of her home, the tension in her chest had grown into something sharp, something like guilt. She placed the tote on the low brick wall for a moment, the sound of clinking glass jars breaking the silence, and she looked at him. Really looked at him this time. His fur was tangled with burrs. His body carried the story of too many nights spent on cold ground. And yet when the lamplight fell across his face, it revealed not just weariness but resilience, not just need, but something like quiet trust. He had chosen her, and she knew it, though she had no idea why. The gate stood open now, the threshold between her ordinary life and whatever this was, and, as she gripped the metal and hesitated, she felt her thoughts racing. Should I turn him away? Should I pretend this never happened? What if he belongs to someone? What if he's sick? What if taking him in changes everything? The questions tumbled one after the other, and still, the dog didn't move closer. He simply stood at the edge of her path, waiting for her decision. Anna realized her heart was beating faster than it should have, as if the weight of this simple choice carried consequences far beyond tonight. And perhaps it did. She thought of the empty apartment behind her, the silence that always greeted her when she set her groceries down, the lonely meals eaten with nothing but the hum of the fridge to keep her company. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe that silence didn't have to be permanent. The dog shifted then, his floppy ear twitching, his tail giving the faintest wag, and Anna felt her breath catch because there was something in that tiny gesture that felt enormous, something that said, "I'll wait as long as it takes, but I've already chosen you." She bent down slightly, her fingers brushing against the cool iron of the gate, and whispered aloud, almost to herself, "Why are you following me?" But of course, there was no answer, only those dark eyes fixed on hers, steady and patient. And in that moment, Anna knew this was no accident. She knew her life had been moving in quiet, predictable lines until tonight, and that the presence of this fragile, persistent stranger might redraw those lines completely. But what could she do? Leave him out there in the night, to fend for himself? Or open her world, even just a crack, and risk what might come of it? Her hand hovered at the gate, her heart pounding, as she realized she had reached a turning point. And so the chapter ends not with certainty, but with the weight of a question, the kind that lingers in your mind long after the story pauses. Would she open the gate and let him into her world, or close it and let him fade back into the shadows? Because in that decision, in that single moment of choice, lay the beginning of everything that was about to change. The iron gate creaked softly as Anna stood frozen, her hand gripping the cool metal, her mind filled with a dozen arguments pulling her in different directions. And for a moment she almost convinced herself to turn away, to shut the gate quietly, to let the dog remain on the sidewalk where strays belonged, because after all she had never planned to bring another life into her small apartment, never imagined she would become responsible for something so vulnerable, so unpredictable. But then the sound of a low whimper, so soft she might have missed it if the night were not so still, reached her ears, and it was enough to undo every reason she thought she had. She pushed the gate open wider, her breath held tight in her chest, and, as the gap widened, the stray did not leap forward, did not rush in as though desperate to claim the warmth inside, but instead sat down just beyond the threshold, his bony haunches resting against the cold pavement, his eyes steady upon her, as if to say, "I'll come when you tell me I can." And wasn't that strange, she thought, that a creature with so little left to lose could still wait with such patience, as though respect for boundaries were something he had learned through hardship and loss. Anna knelt down slowly, her knees brushing the gravel, and set the canvas tote on the step beside her, pulling out a small bag of bread she had bought on her way home, and with hands that trembled ever so slightly, she tore a piece free and laid it on the stone before him. Then waited, half expecting him to lunge forward with hunger, half fearing he might shy away and leave, but instead he inched closer, one hesitant step at a time, lowering his nose to sniff, glancing up at her as though for permission, before finally taking the offering gently between his teeth, chewing slowly, almost reverently, as if each bite were not merely food but a promise that trust might be possible after all. The days that followed were stitched together with these small moments, not grand gestures but quiet acts of patience and repetition. And Anna found herself leaving a dish of water outside her door, setting scraps from her meals on the step, and though the dog never forced his way in, never barked for more, he began to linger longer each evening, curling up on the mat by her door as if her threshold had become a safe place. And in the mornings when she opened the blinds, she would catch sight of him still there, his tail thumping weakly against the ground in a greeting that made her chest ache with something she could not yet name. And isn't it remarkable, she thought, how quickly the presence of another being can shift the air in a home, how silence that once felt heavy with loneliness could suddenly feel lighter, touched with the promise of companionship, even if that companionship had not yet crossed the doorway. Each night she would listen for the sound of his breathing just beyond the door, steady and reassuring, and she would wonder, what life did he live before this one? Who turned him away? Who let him slip through the cracks? And if no one claimed him now, would I be able to send him back to that same emptiness? But the neighborhood was not blind to his presence, and whispers began to reach her ears, the woman at the corner shop shaking her head and muttering that strays brought fleas and disease, the older man who walked his own dog warning that she might regret letting a street animal linger so close. And though their words pricked at her doubts, every time she looked at those eyes, eyes filled with trust he had no reason to give her. She felt those doubts dissolve like sugar in tea. One evening, as she sat on the step with him beside her, his ribs still visible but his tail wagging stronger now, she reached out a tentative hand, unsure if he would flinch, unsure if her touch would be too much too soon. But instead he leaned forward and pressed his cold nose in her palm, a gesture so simple, yet so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes, because in that moment she knew he was no longer a stranger, no longer a nameless wanderer, but something else, something closer, something that belonged to her heart, even if she had not yet spoken it aloud. She began to call him Shadow, not because his fur was dark, but because he had become her quiet follower, her constant presence, the figure that moved wherever she moved. And though the name slipped from her lips softly at first, uncertain, soon it became natural, and every time his floppy ear twitched at the sound of it, she felt as though she had given him something that could never be taken away: identity, belonging, a place in her story. But trust, as she learned, was not a straight road, and there were moments that tested it. Like the night thunder rolled across the sky and Shadow bolted from the porch, vanishing into the alley in blind fear, leaving Anna's chest hollow with worry as she called into the storm, her voice swallowed by rain, or the afternoon when a neighbor's child reached out too quickly and Shadow recoiled, growling low, reminding her that scars from a past life do not vanish with kindness alone. And isn't that the truth for all of us? That healing comes not in a single leap, but in cautious steps, forward and backward, until one day you realize the distance you've crossed? Yet for every setback there was a breakthrough, like the morning she opened her door to find Shadow not lying outside, but standing squarely in the doorway, waiting, hesitant but determined, as if asking the question silently. "May I come in?" And with her heart pounding, she stepped aside, letting him pad across the threshold, his paws clicking softly against the wooden floor, his nose lifting to take in the sense of a home that was not yet his, but soon would be. The first night he slept inside, curled tightly on a blanket she laid at the foot of her bed. Anna lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, and she realized that for the first time in years she did not feel entirely alone, that the walls of her small apartment felt less like barriers and more like shelter, not just for her, but for him too. And she wondered if perhaps this was what fate looked like. Not grand, not obvious, but subtle, arriving in the form of a stray who simply would not stop following. But just as the threads of trust were beginning to weave a new life for them both, shadows of uncertainty crept in, because the world beyond her door was not as forgiving as her heart, and whispers grew louder. Someone in the neighborhood had called the shelter. Someone had complained about a stray roaming the block. Someone had seen him and decided he didn't belong here. And as Anna listened to the murmurs, a dread settled over her, a fear that the fragile bond she and Shadow had built might be torn apart before it had fully taken root. And so, with Shadow asleep at her feet, unaware of the forces gathering against him, while Anna lies awake, her heart heavy with the knowledge that trust is hard to earn but can be lost in an instant, and she asks the question that hangs like a storm cloud over them both. Would she be able to protect him when the world came knocking? Or would the stray who had finally found a home be taken from her before he could truly believe he belonged? The night the whispers reached Anna in full, the night when the neighbor's sharp words about calling animal control echoed through the thin walls of her apartment, she lay awake with her heart clenched so tightly it felt as if her chest might break, her eyes fixed on the silhouette of the dog curled at her feet, his fragile frame rising and falling with each peaceful breath, completely unaware of the storm that threatened to unravel the fragile haven they had built together. And in that moment Anna realized that the world would always find a reason to cast out those who didn't fit neatly into its boundaries. But perhaps love, if strong enough, could redraw those lines. She rose before dawn, her feet bare against the cool floor, her breath fogging faintly against the window glass as she peered out into the misty street. And she knew she had a choice to make, a choice that could no longer be delayed. Because waiting meant giving power to others who did not see Shadow the way she did, not as a nuisance or a danger, but as a soul whose trust had been a gift too rare to squander. So she knelt beside him, her hand brushing lightly across the once dull fur that already showed the faint sheen of care, and she whispered his name with a tremor in her voice. "Shadow, I won't let them take you. and though he could not understand the words, the way his tail gave a slow, steady wag made her believe he felt the promise. The following days unfolded in a haze of decisions and quiet determination, as Anna made the call she had been afraid to make, reaching out to a local veterinarian who agreed to see Shadow, arranging for vaccinations, a checkup, and papers that could transform him in the eyes of the law from a stray to a pet, from a question mark to a certainty. And though the process was not simple and the bills were heavier than she expected, she felt each signature, each receipt, each small sacrifice was more than worth it, because with every step Shadow was being woven more firmly into her life, his belonging no longer just written in her heart, but recorded in ink. And isn't it remarkable how quickly the transformation of care reveals itself? How in the span of weeks the ribs that once stood out starkly began to fade beneath a healthy weight. How the tail that once wagged faintly grew strong and quick. How the fur that had been patchy and dull began to glimmer under the sunlight until he looked less like a ghost of a dog and more like a living, breathing joy. Anna found herself marveling daily at these changes. And yet the greatest change was not in Shadow at all, but in herself. Because where she had once walked through life quietly, accepting loneliness as though it were permanent, she now moved with a companion at her side, a shadow that no longer haunted her, but uplifted her. And for the first time she felt her home echo not with emptiness, but with laughter, warmth, and love. The neighborhood, too, began to soften, for though some had doubted at first, the sight of Shadow trotting proudly beside Anna on their morning walks, his floppy ear bouncing comically with every step, drew smiles instead of frowns, and the children who once shied away now reached out eager hands to stroke his head, their giggles ringing out as he leaned into their affection. His earlier growls replaced by gentle patience, and slowly, without anyone saying it directly, he was accepted, not just as Anna's dog, but as a part of the community itself, a reminder that sometimes the things we fear or dismiss are the very things that carry the most light. But the true turning point came one late evening when Anna, weary from a long day, sat on her porch with Shadow stretched across her feet, and she found herself speaking aloud without planning to, telling him how she had felt before he appeared, how empty the rooms had seemed, how heavy the days had been, and how she never imagined that her life could shift so completely because of one silent follower on a gray street. And as the words spilled from her, Shadow lifted his head, meeting her eyes with that steady gaze of his, and she thought, maybe it wasn't me who saved him, maybe it was him who saved me. And isn't that the question we always come back to? When love grows in unexpected places, who rescues who? The bond between them deepened in ways that could not be measured, not in papers or collars, or even in routines, but in the way Shadow seemed to sense her moods, pressing his head in her lap on the nights when tears blurred her vision, bounding through the apartment with gleeful energy when laughter returned to her lips, standing guard by the window when shadows of worry tried to creep back into her heart. And it became impossible to imagine how she had ever walked those streets alone, how she had ever eaten dinners without the thump of a tail beneath the table, how she had ever lived without the sound of four paws pacing lightly beside her own. And so the conflict that had once threatened to tear them apart resolved itself not in dramatic confrontation, but in quiet resilience, in Anna's refusal to let go, and in Shadow's refusal to leave, and together they wrote a story of belonging that no neighbor's complaint, no stranger's doubt, could erase, a story that reminded anyone who cared to notice that sometimes the smallest decision, opening a gate, offering a piece of bread, whispering a name, can ripple outward until it changes the course of an entire life. As months passed and seasons turned, Anna would often think back to that first night, to the moment when she looked over her shoulder and saw him trailing her, his thin frame etched against the dim lamplight, and she would ask herself with quiet wonder, what if I had shut the gate? What if I had walked inside and let him remain out there in the cold? Will my life still be the same? Would I still be the same? And the thought always left her with a shiver, not of fear but of gratitude, because the answer was simple. No, nothing would be the same, and thank goodness for that. In the end, it was not a grand adventure or a dramatic rescue that defined their story, but the gentle unfolding of love born from patience, from trust, from the courage to say yes when it would have been easier to say no. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary change of all, that ordinary moments, when met with compassion, can bloom into something that reshapes us completely. Sometimes life doesn't ask us to be heroes. It simply asks us to open the gate. Sometimes the ones who follow us home aren't looking for rescue at all. They're bringing it. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest changes in our lives don't arrive with fanfare or certainty, but in the quiet footsteps of a stray who chooses us, and in choosing us, teaches us that we were never meant to walk alone.